Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Carrolet Thomas, and welcome to my channel. Thank you to those of you who have subscribed to my channel, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything. Today's message is, do not be unequally yoked. This is a prophetic word and prophetic warning from God. Do not be unequally yoked. Believe it or not, there are many people who are unequally yoked with people, whether romantically and or in marriage, in friendship, in business, with associates, and some family ties. But before we go any further, to be clear, let's look at what it means to be unequally yoked. To be unequally yoked is a biblical principle warning against entering into deeply intimate, binding relationships with people who do not share your core beliefs, values, or life direction. The phrase comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 14 in the Bible, which says, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers." The meaning behind the metaphor: a yoke was a heavy wooden beam placed across the shoulders of two draft animals, like oxen, so they could work together to plow a field. Equal yoking. Animals of the same size, strength, and training were yoked together. They could walk in a straight line and pull the load efficiently because they moved in the same direction at the same pace. Unequal yoking. If you yoke two completely different animals together, such as an ox, strong and tall, and a donkey, weaker and shorter, the result was chaos. Because they had different gaits, strengths, and purposes, they couldn't pull together, resulting in broken lines, frustration, and a stalled mission. Where this applies: in everyday life, being yoked refers to any close foundational partnership. It is most commonly applied to three areas: marriage and dating. Entering a romantic relationship with someone who fundamentally disagrees with your spiritual, moral, or ethical worldview can create tension when making major life decisions. Business partnerships. Going into business with a partner who has opposite ethical standards can cause constant conflict over business practices and financial decisions. Close friendships. The people you allow to influence your day-to-day thinking deeply affect your own direction. What it doesn't mean. The principle is about fellowship, sharing in common, not isolation. It does not mean Christians should cut themselves off from the rest of the world. It is entirely acceptable and encouraged to have cordial, loving, and respectful relationships with people of different backgrounds. The warning is strictly against binding yourself in a way that compromises your faith or pulls you away from your intended path. Being equally yoked is not just a physical thing. I have heard people say that two people should be married because they look good together. Looking good is relative, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But either way, looking good together does not mean that people are equally yoked. I have heard people say that two people should be married because they have the same level of education. Just because two people have the same level of education does not mean that they are equally yoked. I have heard people say that two people should be married because they have the same standard of living or income status. Just because two people have the same or similar amounts of money does not mean that they are equally yoked. I have heard people say that two people should be married because they are both of the same faith. Just because two people have the same faith does not mean that they are equally yoked. I have heard people say that two people should be married because they run around in the same circles and or know the same people and or know people of high status. Just because two people have similar circles and know people of high status does not mean that they are equally yoked. I have heard people say that two people should be married because they are both in leadership. Just because two people are in leadership does not mean that they are equally yoked. I have heard people say that two people should be friends because they have something in common. Just because two people have something in common does not mean that they are equally yoked. I have heard people say that two people should be business partners because they are in the same industry. Just because two people are in the same industry does not mean that they are equally yoked. I have heard people say that family is over everything and blood is thicker than water. Just because people are family does not mean that they are equally yoked. And nothing and no thing, nobody and nobody should be over God. But I digress. Being equally yoked is a spiritual thing and is ultimately in obedience to God. What God says trumps everything and everybody, no matter who likes it and no matter who doesn't. For this prophetic word, we are going to look at some biblical examples of different kinds of relationships where people were unequally yoked and the outcomes. First, let's look at unequally yoked family relationships. Cain and Abel. Theologians and commentators often point to the tragic story of Cain and Abel as the first historical example of this spiritual incompatibility in action. Cain and Abel, the story of spiritual incompatibility. Although they were brothers, Cain and Abel represent two entirely different belief systems, approaches to God, and moral directions. Abel's approach. Abel was a shepherd who brought the firstborn of his flock as an offering. He acted in faith, recognizing his need for grace and giving God his very best. Cain's approach. Cain was a farmer who brought the fruit of the soil. Commentators note that Cain's offering was an attempt to earn God's favor through his own works, rather than trusting in God's prescribed way. The outcome. Because their hearts and spiritual trajectories were fundamentally at odds, the situation ended in a catastrophic outcome. Rejection. God looked with favor on Abel's offering, but rejected Cain's. Resentment and anger. God warned Cain to master his sin, but Cain let his jealousy and pride consume him. The first murder. Driven by a desire to control and destroy the righteous example his brother set, Cain enticed Abel to a field and murdered him. The story illustrates the theological warning that the flesh and the spirit are at war. When ungodliness, Cain, is yoked to or attempts to coexist with righteousness, Abel, the fundamental difference in purpose and worldview often results in hostility and destruction rather than unity. There is something real that is called sibling rivalry, and it is nothing to play with. Oftentimes, whether people want to admit it or not, there is a lot of competition, comparison, jealousy, envy, and covetousness, and sometimes crab mentality that is going on in families. And when it gets out of hand, it can lead to loss of life. Sibling rivalry is the ongoing competition, jealousy, and conflict between brothers and sisters raised in the same family. It typically manifests as bickering, physical scuffles, or vying for parental attention and affection. Why it happens? Children in a family often feel they need to compete for limited resources, such as toys, privileges, or parental affection. At its core, this dynamic is frequently rooted in a child's insecurity about their place in the family or a sense of disconnection. It is generally more prominent when siblings are close in age, of the same gender, or when dealing with transitions like the birth of a new baby. Normal part of childhood versus when to worry. It is completely normal for siblings to argue and test boundaries as they develop. In fact, it can be constructive. By navigating these conflicts, children often learn vital life skills like negotiation, cooperation, sharing, and seeing another person's perspective. However, intervention or professional help may be needed if the dynamic shifts into toxic or abusive territory. Red flags that indicate the rivalry requires attention include physical violence, when fights result in frequent or severe injuries; emotional abuse, relentless bullying, intense name-calling, or psychological manipulation; extreme fear, if one sibling appears genuinely terrified of or constantly intimidated by the other. Understanding and managing this dynamic properly ensures it remains a healthy learning experience rather than a source of lasting trauma. In my observation, this type of behavior begins in childhood, which means that parents are responsible for steering their children in the direction that they should go, rather than ignoring, placating, brushing off, instigating, etc. bad behavior of their children towards one another. Here's another example: Joseph and his brothers. In biblical history, the story of Joseph and his brothers illustrates the disastrous consequences of unequal yoking, in this case, parental favoritism, and deeply fractured sibling relationships. This intense family dysfunction drove the brothers to sell Joseph into slavery, though God ultimately used this to save the family. The root cause: the unequal yoking, favoritism. The concept of being unequally yoked describes joining two fundamentally incompatible or misaligned entities. In Joseph's family, the root of the problem lay in blatant parental favoritism, the coat of many colors. Jacob loved Joseph, the son of his old age, and his favorite wife, Rachel. He gave Joseph an ornate, special robe, a glaring symbol that alienated the other brothers, the sons of Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. The arrogant reports: Jacob tasked Joseph with supervising his older brothers and bringing back bad reports regarding their behavior. Prophetic dreams. Joseph further alienated his brothers by sharing prophetic dreams in which he ruled over them, causing deep resentment. The outcome. This imbalance led to severe escalating consequences: betrayal and slavery. Consumed by jealousy, the brothers originally plotted to kill Joseph. Instead, they threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery in Egypt for 20 pieces of silver, faking his death to deceive their father. Joseph's rise and testing. In Egypt, Joseph suffered years of slavery and unjust imprisonment, but ultimately rose to become second in command. Reunion and reconciliation. When a severe famine struck, Joseph's brothers traveled to Egypt for grain, not recognizing their brother. After testing them to see if they had changed, especially regarding their treatment of his youngest brother, Benjamin, Joseph revealed his identity. Providential good. Rather than retaliate, Joseph forgave his brothers. He recognized that God allowed the betrayal so he could rise to power and save the entire region and his family from starvation. Next, family friends, Orpah and Ruth. The concept of being unequally yoked, deriving from 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, describes the spiritual mismatch when a believer and non-believer are bound together. In the book of Ruth, Orpah and Ruth make diverging choices when faced with this spiritual reality, which resulted in vastly different historical and spiritual outcomes. The context of the marriages. Naomi and her husband relocated to Moab to escape a famine in Bethlehem. Their 2 sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Because the Moabites worshiped false pagan gods, these marriages left the Israelite sons, theological and covenantal believers, unequally yoked in their unions. After about 10 years of marriage, Naomi's husband and both of her sons passed away, leaving the 3 women as widows. The crossroads, and this is in Ruth chapter 1. Left destitute in a foreign land, Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem and urged her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab, where they had a better chance of remarrying and securing a future. Orpah's choice. Orpah initially wept and expressed a desire to go with Naomi, but ultimately allowed pragmatism to win. She chose to return to her people and her gods in Moab. Ruth's choice. Ruth refused to leave Naomi. She made a declaration of faith to abandon the false gods of Moab, stating, "Your people will be my people, and your God my God." The outcomes. Orpah's outcome, by turning back to the familiar, Orpah avoided the hardships of moving to a foreign land. She likely remarried and had children, living a comfortable and conventional life. However, biblical and historically, she faded into obscurity, returning to the false gods of her homeland. Ruth's outcome. Ruth chose the path of faith and hardship over comfort. She traveled to Bethlehem, eventually met Naomi's kinsman redeemer Boaz, and married him. This faithful union led to Ruth becoming the great-grandmother of King David. Consequently, she holds the prestigious honor of being one of the few women explicitly named in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and that's Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Sometimes friendships are just for a season, and when your season changes, you change with the season. Next, associates. The 2 prostitutes. The 2 women in 1 Kings chapter 3 were not unequally yoked, a term usually referencing binding believers and unbelievers. Instead, the phrase refers to the biblical story of two prostitutes who lived together and had babies 3 days apart. Their conflict and its outcome are detailed. The conflict, the incident, both women gave birth, but one infant died during the night. The mother of the deceased baby stole the living baby and placed the dead baby in the arms of the other woman. The dispute: when the mother awoke to nurse her son, she realized the child was dead, but quickly recognized the living baby as her own. The other woman denied the claim, leaving the matter unresolved and brought before King Solomon. The test and outcome. Solomon's test. With no witnesses and only one woman's word against the others, King Solomon tested their maternal instincts by calling for a sword and commanding that the living baby be divided into two, with half given to each woman. The outcome. The true mother was instantly revealed because she pleaded with Solomon to spare the child's life and give it to the other woman. The deceptive woman, driven by spite, agreed the child should be cut in half. The judgment. Recognizing the true mother's genuine compassion, Solomon ordered the baby to be given to her unharmed. Let this be the proof that you cannot live with everybody. Some people will do anything, including taking what rightfully belongs to you, sometimes without your knowledge and/or your permission. And lastly, business relationships. King Xerxes and Haman. In the biblical book of Esther, King Xerxes and his vizier Haman were unequally yoked by deeply conflicting ultimate motives. Xerxes sought to maintain empire-wide peace and unify his subjects, whereas Haman was driven by a selfish vendetta. Their mismatched alliance quickly dissolved into betrayal and ruin. How they were unequally yoked. Conflicting motivations. Xerxes was an impulsive, power-distributing monarch whose primary goal was running his vast empire, while Haman used his newly elevated status to settle personal grudges. The root of the wedge. Haman's intense pride drove him to demand universal bowing from royal subjects. Mordecai, a Jewish man, refused. This single offense led Haman to manipulate Xerxes into legally authorizing the genocide of all Jewish people in the Persian Empire. Deceptive execution. Haman secured the decree without initially disclosing to Xerxes which specific group of people he was targeting for annihilation. The outcome. The interruption. Queen Esther, who was secretly Jewish, risked her life to host a banquet where she revealed Haman's plot and her own Jewish heritage. Haman's downfall. Enraged by the deception and Haman's attempt to compromise his queen, Xerxes ordered Haman to be executed on the very 50-foot high gallows Haman had built specifically for Mordecai. Shifting power. Following Haman's execution, his estate was awarded to Esther, and Mordecai was promoted to Haman's position to supreme authority in the kingdom. You have to be very prayerful and careful about who you trust as an assistant to you. They need to be doing the right thing when you are looking and listening and when you are not. The Bible tells us to pray without ceasing in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 17. And when we pray, we need to listen for what God tells us and then obey God in word and in deed, in spirit and in truth, without debate and without delay. And a bit of advice that I try to live by that has served me well is a quote from Dr. Maya Angelou. She said, "When people show you who they are, believe them the first time." And today's prophetic word and warning is telling us today, do not be unequally yoked. Because life is short and time is passing, and ain't nobody got time for that. I hope and pray that this message has been a blessing to you. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you feel led, you can make a donation. Thank you for listening and supporting my YouTube channel. God bless you and just be happy.